She'd been baking that pie every Tuesday for 2 years and 4 months. Not because she loved the smell of cinnamon before sunrise. Not because the apples in her orchard were at their peak that particular morning. And certainly not because she had nothing better to do with her hands at 5 o'clock in the morning while the rest of Wyoming still slept. She baked it because of him. And she had never told a single living soul. But on the morning everything changed, the morning Silas Boone finally stopped his horse outside her window, it wasn't the pie that broke open 2 years of careful silence. It was what he said next. I said, "This pie smells wonderful." And without thinking, without planning, without one single moment of the careful control she had maintained for 2 long years, Evelyn Harper whispered back, "Not as wonderful as you." The words left her mouth before she could catch them. And the look on Silas Boone's face, that weathered, grief-carved, carefully guarded face, told her that neither of them would ever be the same again. If you were standing in her kitchen that morning, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every single week we bring you stories just like this one. Stories about love found late, courage found slow, and the kind of quiet bravery that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really began. The morning Silas Boone first noticed the smell, he told himself it meant nothing. He was 51 years old. He had a ranch to run, a fence line that needed inspecting every Tuesday before the temperature dropped, and the ground started playing tricks on a man who wasn't paying attention, and a teenage son at home who could burn water if left unsupervised in the kitchen. He did not have time to notice smells coming from his neighbor's farmhouse. But the smell noticed him anyway. It came through the trees on the north end of his property, warm and sweet and heavy with cinnamon, and it hit him somewhere behind the sternum, in the exact place he had been careful not to let anything hit him in going on 3 years. He pulled his horse to a slow walk without meaning to. Old Copper, who had been Silas's horse for 11 years and understood his moods the way most people understood weather, slowed without being asked and turned one ear back toward his rider like a question. Silas gave him a nudge and kept going. That was the first Tuesday. The second Tuesday, the smell was there again. Same time, same trees, same place in his chest that he refused to acknowledge. He kept his eyes on the fence line and his jaw set and his hands easy on the reins, and he rode past Evelyn Harper's farmhouse the same way he had been riding past it for the past 3 years, like a man who had somewhere important to be and no time at all for distractions. But his pace had slowed, and he didn't notice until he was already past the tree line. He told himself it was Copper being difficult. Copper was not being difficult. Copper was, in fact, doing exactly what Silas told him to do. Copper was not the problem, and somewhere deep in his chest Silas knew it, and that knowing sat there all week like a splinter he couldn't reach. By the fourth Tuesday, he had started checking the time before he left. He was disgusted with himself about that. He stood in the barn at 7:45 in the morning with his hand on Copper's saddle and his watch in his other hand, and he thought, "You are a 51-year-old man, Silas Boone, and you are checking your pocket watch because of a pie." He put the watch away. He saddled the horse. He rode the fence line like he always did, and he reached the north end at 8 o'clock exactly, and the smell came through the trees like it had been waiting for him, and something in his chest did a thing he didn't have a name for and hadn't had a name for in 3 years. He rode home and didn't speak at breakfast. Noah, who was 16 that autumn and already developing the unsettling ability to read his father with more accuracy than Silas was comfortable with, looked up from his eggs and looked back down again without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. "Don't," Silas said. "I didn't say a word," Noah said. "I know what you were thinking." "Then you're the one with the problem," Noah said, and went back to his eggs, and Silas had nothing useful to say to that, so he drank his coffee and stared out the window at the north fence line, and categorically refused, to think about apple pie. Evelyn Harper was 47 years old, and had been running her farm alone for going on 5 years, since the spring her husband Martin had gone into town for fence wire and a cough that had been hanging around all winter and had come home 3 weeks later with neither the wire nor the cough, because the cough had turned into something the doctor in Casper called consumption, and had taken Martin Harper out of the world with a speed that still, 5 years on, sometimes made Evelyn stop whatever she was doing and stand completely still for a full minute. Martin had been a good man, not a perfect man. He had been stubborn about money, worse about asking for help, and had once let a fence section rot for 2 full seasons before Evelyn fixed it herself. But a good one, steady and warm and reliably present in the way that you only truly understand the value of after someone is gone. She had grieved him properly. She had given herself time and space and the winter to fall apart, and then she had gotten up in the spring and planted her orchard and fixed Martin's fence and kept going, because the land didn't care about grief, and neither did the bills, and neither did the apple trees, which had their own schedule and respected no one's emotional state. She did not need rescuing. She had made that clear to several well-meaning neighbors in the first year, most notably to Reverend Aldous, who had suggested she might want to consider selling the South Field and moving into town, and to whom she had responded with a politeness that left no actual room for misunderstanding. She was not moving into town. She was not selling the South Field. She was not interested in being looked after, managed, advised, or relocated. She was interested in growing apples and maintaining her own property and living her own life on her own terms, and she had done exactly that for 5 years, and she was, by most honest measures, fine. The problem, and she spent considerable effort not calling it a problem, was Tuesday mornings. She had noticed Silas Boone's fence inspection route in the 3rd week after she moved into the farmhouse. He was regular as a clock, 8 in the morning, north fence, every Tuesday without fail. And she had noticed this the way a person notices anything that passes by their window on a schedule, with mild, impersonal curiosity. The first pie had genuinely been an accident. She had been up early that September morning 2 years ago, unable to sleep, and she had gone to the kitchen and done what she always did when she couldn't sleep, which was find something useful to do with her hands. She had apples in abundance. It was harvest season. And she had baked a pie, and when it came out of the oven at 7:45 and she opened the kitchen window to let the heat out, Silas Boone had been riding past the tree line at exactly that moment, and he had slowed, just barely, just for a second, and then ridden on. She had thought nothing of it. The second Tuesday she told herself she was baking because she had more apples than she could sell before they turned. The 3rd Tuesday she told herself she liked having something warm in the kitchen in the morning. By the 5th Tuesday she had stopped explaining it to herself because the explanations were getting increasingly unconvincing, and she was a practical woman who did not enjoy lying, especially not to herself. She baked the pie because of Silas Boone. She did not examine what that meant. She baked the pie and opened the kitchen window at 7:55 and kept her hands busy rolling out the next crust or checking the orchard ledger or doing absolutely anything that wasn't standing at the window, watching for a man on a horse who had never once stopped, who had never once looked directly at her farmhouse, who had given her no reason whatsoever to believe he thought about her at all. She was not waiting. She was baking. There was a difference, and she held on to that difference with both hands. The first time they actually spoke, really spoke, more than a wave across a fence line or a nod at the general store in town, was in October of the 2nd year, when a section of Evelyn's north fence came down in a windstorm, and 3 of her apple trees went with it. She was out at first light assessing the damage when she heard Copper's hooves on the trail, and then Silas Boone was there, coming around the tree line on his Tuesday morning route, and he pulled up at the sight of the downed fence and the downed trees and Evelyn standing in the middle of it all, with mud on her boots and her hair coming out of its pin, and what she was fairly sure was a look on her face that could have cured leather. He sat on his horse for a moment without speaking. "Before you say anything," Evelyn said, "I am already planning to fix it." "I wasn't going to say anything," Silas said. "You had a look." "I had a look at your fence, which is on the ground." "I can see where my fence is." There was a pause. Silas looked at the fence. He looked at the trees. He looked at the mud, which was extensive, and at the apple trees, which were genuinely a loss. 2 of them snapped clean at the base, one leaning at an angle that wasn't going to improve. "That middle tree might be saved," he said, "if you prop it up in the next day or so and pack the roots." Evelyn looked at the middle tree. She had been thinking the same thing, but hadn't been sure, and it irritated her slightly that he had said it first. "I know," she said. "I could—" He stopped. She looked at him. I have fencing wire, he said. More than I need right now. She opened her mouth to say that she had her own wire on order from town, and then she looked at the gap in the fence and the 3 sections that had gone with it and thought about the apples on the ground and the price she was going to lose and the order that wasn't going to arrive for another 10 days, and she said, "That would be useful. Thank you." It was the most either of them had said to each other in 3 years of being neighbors. He brought the wire the next morning, not Tuesday, Wednesday, which meant he had come out of his way. She didn't say anything about that. He fixed the fence in under an hour, working with the efficient, quiet competence of a man who had been doing physical work all his life and didn't need to make a production of it. And she brought him coffee because it was cold, and he had brought her wire, and it seemed like the human thing to do. He drank the coffee standing up, with his coat still on, and he didn't take his hat off, which she noticed, and which she understood without needing it explained. This was not a social call. This was a neighbor helping a neighbor. The hat staying on said, "I am not staying. I am not making this into something it isn't." "The tree will take," he said, looking at the propped-up apple tree she had packed that morning. "I think so," she said. He handed back the coffee mug. "Let me know if the wire doesn't hold." "I will," she said. He nodded and walked back to his horse and rode back toward his own property. And Evelyn stood in her yard with the empty coffee mug and the fixed fence and watched him go, and did not let herself think about the way her hands had been steady the whole morning until he rode away, and then suddenly weren't. The Tuesdays continued. The pie continued. And something shifted, slowly, the way things shift in winter, imperceptibly and then all at once, in the quality of Silas Boone's ride past her property. He still didn't stop. He still didn't wave. But his pace had changed in a way that had nothing to do with Copper, and there were mornings when Evelyn, not standing at the window, categorically not standing at the window, caught the shape of him through the glass at exactly 8 o'clock and thought she saw his head turn, just slightly, toward the farmhouse. She told herself she was imagining it. Noah Boone she knew better than his father, in the way that teenagers are sometimes easier to know than their parents. They hadn't yet built up the same quality of wall. He came by the farm occasionally to help with heavy lifting, for which she paid him a fair wage and fed him lunch. And he was a serious, thoughtful boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw, and a quality of watchfulness that was slightly unnerving in a 16-year-old. One afternoon in November, he sat at her kitchen table eating the second half of a Tuesday pie. It never lasted past Wednesday. And he said without looking up from his plate, "My dad mentions your fence sometimes." Evelyn set down her coffee cup. "Does he?" "Not in a weird way," Noah said, still not looking up. "Just mentions it, like Harper's fence is holding well or whatever." "That's very practical of him," Evelyn said. Noah looked up then, and for a moment his expression was so precisely the expression of a teenage boy trying very hard not to say what he was actually thinking that Evelyn almost laughed, and almost crying at the same time, which was the more complicated impulse. "He doesn't talk about much," Noah said. "Just, your fence." Evelyn picked up her coffee cup again. "Your father is a private man." "Yeah," Noah said. He looked back at his pie. "He is." There was a silence in the kitchen that said several things neither of them put into words, and then Noah finished his pie and thanked her and went home. And Evelyn washed the plate and the cup and dried them and put them away and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too large and too fragile a word for what it was. More like the possibility of hope. The space where hope could, if it wanted to, eventually take up residence. She turned off the kitchen light and went to check on the apple trees, because that was what she did. And the trees were coming along fine, and the propped-up one Silas had said would take had taken, and she put her hand on the bark and stood in her orchard in the November cold and thought, 2 years and 4 months. That was how long she had been baking that pie. She was 51. She had a working farm and a good orchard and a life she had built with her own 2 hands, and she was not, she told herself firmly, she was not going to spend the rest of it baking pie for a man who couldn't slow his horse down long enough to look at her kitchen window. She went back inside. She set the alarm for 5. She would bake next Tuesday. It was the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. cold enough to see your breath. The sky, that particular shade of pale gray that Wyoming wears in late November, like a coat. When Silas Boone finally stopped his horse. Evelyn heard it before she saw it. The change in hoofbeats, prati, the rhythm breaking, slowing, stopping. She was at the kitchen counter, and she froze with her hands in the pie crust, and she did not turn around. She heard Copper shift his weight. She heard the creak of the saddle. She did not turn around. And then, from outside the window, came the voice she had been hearing from a distance for 2 years and 4 months, and it was closer now, much closer, and it said, I said, a pause. A throat cleared. The voice of a man who had been talking to almost no one for 3 years trying to remember how this worked. That pie smells wonderful. Evelyn Harper turned around. He was right there. On the other side of the glass, close enough that she could see the frost on his coat collar and the careful, terrified look on his face. The look of a man who had just done the bravest thing he had done in years and was not entirely sure he was going to survive it. She opened her mouth. Her brain said, say something polite, say thank you, say it's just apples and cinnamon, say something safe, say something that doesn't change everything. What came out was, not as wonderful as you. The silence that followed lasted approximately 1 second, which felt considerably longer to both of them. Silas Boone blinked. Evelyn felt the heat climb her face in a way she hadn't felt since she was considerably younger and considerably less mortified by her own mouth. And then, slowly, the way a man moves when he's making a decision he's been circling for a long time, Silas Boone dismounted from his horse, looped Copper's reins around the fence post, and looked up at the kitchen window with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the closest thing to one she had ever seen on that particular face. Did you mean that? He asked. Her hands were still in the pie crust. There was flour on her apron and probably on her face. She was 47 years old, and she was standing in her kitchen with her heart going at a pace that was frankly undignified, and the only honest thing she had said in 2 years and 4 months had just fallen out of her mouth without her permission. She met his eyes through the glass. I baked that pie for you, she said, every Tuesday, for 2 years. The look on Silas Boone's face in the moment after she said that, the complicated, broken open, terrified, grateful look of a man hearing something he had not let himself hope for, was a look she would think about for a long time afterward. He stood at her fence post with his hat in his hands. Come inside, she said, because someone had to, before the pie burns. He came inside, and neither of them, not for a very long time, found a single word to say that was adequate to the moment, which was fine because they were both people who had learned that the most important things often didn't require them. He stayed for 40 minutes. That was the part Evelyn kept coming back to afterward, when she was lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling the way she had been doing for years, except now with considerably more material to work with. 40 minutes. She knew because she had looked at the clock when he came in. 8:03, the pie just pulling back from the edge of burning. And she had looked at it again when he stood up to leave, and it said 8:43. And in between those 2 times, they had sat at her kitchen table and drunk coffee and eaten apple pie and talked about almost nothing of consequence, and it had been the best 40 minutes she'd had in a long time. That was the part that scared her, not the confession. The confession had come out of nowhere and landed, and she had made her peace with it somewhere around Tuesday afternoon, after the initial wave of mortification had passed, and she had settled into a kind of stunned, cautious warmth that she didn't have a word for yet. What scared her was the 40 minutes, the ease of it, the way Silas Boone had sat in her kitchen chair, not comfortably exactly. He was too careful for comfortable. He had sat like a man who was aware of every inch of the space he was taking up, and drunk her coffee and answered her questions about the north pasture with the particular short considered sentences of a man who thought before he spoke, and she had found herself listening to him the way she hadn't listened to another person's voice in a very long time. Martin had been a talker. He had filled rooms, filled silences, filled the space between one thought and the next with words the way some people use furniture, to make the place feel occupied. She had loved that about him. She had also, in the difficult honesty of 5 years of widowhood, recognized that she had sometimes stopped actually listening. Silas was different. Silas left so much silence that the words he did use had weight. She thought about that for 2 days before she was able to identify what it reminded her of, and when she identified it, she lay still in the dark for a full minute because it was the feeling of reading a sentence twice because the first time wasn't enough. She was in serious trouble, and she knew it. The second Tuesday was worse than the first, which she hadn't anticipated. She had expected the second Tuesday to be easier. The confession already made, the worst already over, the ground already broken. What she hadn't expected was that knowing he was coming would be categorically different from hoping he might. That there was a specific quality of nervousness attached to certainty that hope didn't have, and that she would burn the first pie entirely because she was thinking too hard and not paying enough attention to the oven. She burned it at 7:30. She stood in her smoke-filled kitchen, looking at the blackened crust, and felt something very close to fury at herself, then opened all the windows and started over, and she was rolling out the second crust with 15 minutes to spare when she heard Copper on the trail, and her hands went unsteady in a way she resented completely. Silas knocked this time. He had walked up to the door and knocked, hat in hand, and she had opened it, and they had looked at each other for a moment in the kind of silence that happens when two people are both aware that something has changed, and neither one of them is entirely sure what to do with that. "The fence is holding," he said. "I know," she said. "I checked it yesterday." "Good." A pause. "I smelled the—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "I wasn't sure if you— The pie is ready," she said. "Come in." He came in. He sat in the same chair. She noticed that, the same chair, which meant he had chosen it deliberately, which meant he had thought about it. And she poured the coffee and cut the pie, and they sat down across from each other at the kitchen table, and the morning light came through the window, and it was, objectively, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in Wyoming in December, and Evelyn Harper's heart was doing things she was going to have to speak sternly to it about later. "You didn't have to start over," Silas said, nodding toward the window, which she had left cracked open against the residual smoke smell. She looked at him. "What makes you think I started over?" "Smoke on the windowsill," he said simply. "Crust is different color, too. You used the rest of the cinnamon." She stared at him for a moment. "You can tell all of that from looking at a pie." "I ran a cattle operation for 22 years, he said. "You learn to look at things carefully." She didn't know what to say to that, so she drank her coffee. After a moment, she said, "I got distracted." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Her face went warm, and she looked out the window and thought, this man is going to be a problem. Noah found out on a Wednesday. Not because either of them told him. Silas had said nothing when he came home from the first Tuesday, and nothing after the second, and Noah had said nothing about either absence from the breakfast table, which was its own kind of silence because Noah noticed everything and his silences were never empty. He found out because he came by Evelyn's farm on Wednesday afternoon to pick up pay for a fence repair job he'd done the previous week, and he walked around the side of the house to knock on the kitchen door, and through the window he could see 2 coffee cups on the table, both used, and a pie with 2 slices taken from it, and his father's hat on the hook by the door where Martin Harper's coat had used to hang. He stood outside the door for a long moment. Evelyn opened it before he could knock. They looked at each other. She was braced for— she wasn't sure what. Resentment, maybe. Teenagers were complicated about their surviving parent moving toward anything that looked like happiness. She knew that from enough other women's stories. Or protectiveness, maybe. Or just the closed, cautious expression of a boy who wasn't ready to feel anything about this yet. What she did not expect was the expression that actually appeared on Noah Boone's face when he looked at the 2 cups and the pie and his father's hat, which was relief. It crossed his face so quickly she almost missed it, but she had been watching carefully and she didn't miss it, and it hit her somewhere low in the chest, that relief, because it told her something about the past 3 years at that ranch that Silas Boone had never said in words, and probably wouldn't. "He left his hat," Noah said. "He said he'd pick it up Thursday," Evelyn said. Noah nodded. He was working very hard at being casual about this. She could see the effort. "You doing anything with the rest of that pie?" She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll get you a plate." He came in and sat in his father's chair, because of course he chose his father's chair, and ate 2 slices of pie with the focused appreciation of a teenage boy who never turned down food, and Evelyn sat across from him and let the silence be what it was, And after a while, Noah said without looking up, "He's been better. The last couple of weeks. I don't know what changed." Evelyn wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "He slept in," Noah said. "Last Saturday. I came down at 7, and he wasn't up yet. He hasn't slept past 5:30 in 3 years." She didn't say anything. "I didn't wake him," Noah said. He looked up then, and his expression was the complicated expression of a boy who had been carrying something very adult for a very long time. "I just let him sleep." Evelyn looked at this 16-year-old boy across her kitchen table and felt something ache in her chest on his behalf. For the years of watching his father go through the motions, for the careful way he was holding this fragile new thing, for the relief she had seen on his face at the sight of a used coffee cup and a 2-slice pie. "He's a good man," she said carefully. "Your father." Noah looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "He is." And then, "He doesn't always know it." She had nothing to say to that wouldn't have been too much, so she cut him a 3rd slice and refilled the coffee, and they sat in the kitchen until the light outside started going gold. And he went home and she washed the cups, and she stood at the window afterward and thought about Silas Boone sleeping until 7 on a Saturday morning. She thought about that for a long time. December became their month without either of them deciding it. Tuesdays were the anchor, the fixed point, the thing they had built without meaning to build. But the edges of it began to soften and spread in ways that were less fixed and more complicated. He came by on a Thursday in the 2nd week of December to pick up his hat, and he stayed for coffee, and then he came back the following Thursday because one of Evelyn's fence posts on the east side had healed over in the frost, and he had noticed on his Tuesday ride, and it would bother him all week if he didn't fix it, or so he said, and she suspected that was true and also that it wasn't the whole truth. She didn't push. She was learning the rhythm of him, the way he offered help in practical terms when what he meant was something else, the way he asked questions about her orchard and her operation, when what he was really doing was listening to her talk, the way he left before she asked him to and came back before she expected him to, like a man who was trying very carefully to take up exactly the right amount of space and wasn't entirely sure yet how much that was. She was trying too. She had her own habits to manage, the self-sufficiency that had calcified over 5 years into something that occasionally looked like coldness. If you didn't know what you were looking at, the briskness she defaulted to when she was nervous, the tendency she had to fill silences with practical conversation when what she actually wanted to do was say something real. She caught herself doing it one Thursday when he was fixing the fence post, and she had brought him coffee, and she was standing in the cold talking about the apple yield projections for next spring, and she stopped mid-sentence and looked at him and said, "I'm doing it again." He looked up from the post. "Doing what?" "Talking about apples." He considered this. "I don't mind hearing about the apples." "I know you don't," she said. "That's why I keep doing it." He put down the fence tool and looked at her directly, the way he did sometimes, fully, with his whole attention, the way some people never look at each other even after decades. And he said, "Evelyn." Just her name. Nothing attached to it. She looked back at him in the December cold with the coffee going lukewarm in her hands and said, "I'm a little scared of this." He picked up the fence tool again. "Yeah," he said, in the same tone he had used about her fence holding and her pie crust color. The tone of a man stating a fact he had already made peace with. "Me too." That was the closest either of them came to naming it in December. Christmas that year fell on a Thursday. She had not expected that to matter. She had spent 4 of the last 5 Christmases quietly, with a good book and a bottle of wine Martin had laid down before he died and that she had been saving because she couldn't quite bear to open it and couldn't quite bear not to. And it shouldn't have mattered, because Thursday was not Tuesday, and Tuesday was the arrangement, and there was no arrangement about Christmas. Silas showed up at 10 in the morning with Noah and a covered dish of something that turned out to be roasted venison, the best she had ever tasted, made with a recipe that Noah told her had been his mother's. Silas said nothing about the recipe when Noah mentioned it. He set the dish on the counter and took off his coat and looked around her kitchen with the look of a man checking whether he was welcome. And she took his coat without being asked and hung it on the hook where his hat had been, and that was all either of them needed to say about the subject. They ate at her kitchen table, all 3 of them. It was not a perfect meal. Evelyn overcooked the potatoes and Noah knocked over his coffee, and Silas burned his hand on the dish and swore in front of Evelyn and then looked mortified, and she laughed. And the laugh surprised her, came out loud and genuine and a little rusty from disuse, and all three of them looked at each other in the aftermath of it. And something shifted. She hadn't laughed like that since Martin. She didn't say that, but she thought about it later, after they had gone home in the early evening and she was washing up, and she stood at the sink with her hands in the water and let herself feel it without trying to manage it, and what she felt was something warming up inside her that had been very cold for a very long time. She opened the bottle of wine Martin had laid down. She poured one glass. She sat at the table where three people had eaten dinner, and she drank her wine, and she thought about Silas Boone's burned hand and the way he had sworn, and then looked sideways at her like a man expecting to be reprimanded, and the laugh that had come up from somewhere she had forgotten she had. She thought, Martin would have liked him. It hurt and it didn't hurt, in the complicated way that true things sometimes do. January is when things started going wrong, and like most things that go wrong quietly, it happened so gradually that she almost didn't notice until she was already in the middle of it. It started with the Hendersons. Robert and Doris Henderson ran the feed store in town and were, between them, the primary operational system by which information moved through the valley. Not maliciously, not deliberately, but in the way of people who talk a great deal and have a great many friends and do not always distinguish between what was told to them in confidence and what was simply known. They had seen Silas Boone's horse tied to Evelyn Harper's fence post on 2 separate Thursdays, and they had seen the three of them leaving the church social in December in the same general direction, and they were not unobservant people. By the second week of January, the valley had developed an opinion. It wasn't unkind exactly. Wyoming people were not generally unkind, but it was present in the way that community opinion is present, in the quality of the looks Evelyn got at the general store, in the way Doris Henderson asked after her with a slightly different inflection than she had used before, in the way the preacher nodded at her with the particular warmth he reserved for people whose situations he felt he understood. She didn't mention it to Silas. She thought about it for a week and decided it didn't require mentioning. It was the valley's business what the valley thought, and she had spent 5 years being the subject of various forms of community concern, and she had managed all of them adequately. Then Martha Calloway said something to her at the dry goods store on a Thursday afternoon that she did not manage adequately. Martha Calloway was 63, had lived in the valley her whole life, had strong opinions about everything and the social standing to express them freely, and was not a cruel woman, but was the particular kind of well-meaning that sometimes lands worse than cruelty. She had stopped Evelyn near the fabric bolts and put her hand on Evelyn's arm and said, with a smile that was genuinely warm and completely terrible, "We are all just so pleased about you and Silas. After everything that man has been through, it's time he had someone to take care of him." Evelyn stood in the dry goods store with Martha Calloway's hand on her arm and her smile on her face and felt something go very cold and very still inside her. Not about Silas. She knew what Martha meant, and she knew Martha meant it kindly. It was the take care of him. She smiled at Martha and said something appropriate and finished her shopping and drove home, and she was halfway through unhitching the horse from the wagon before she realized her jaw had been clenched so hard for the past hour that her back teeth hurt. She fixed supper and ate it alone and didn't bake anything and went to bed at 8 o'clock, and she lay there in the dark and thought very carefully and honestly about what had made her jaw clench. The answer, when she arrived at it, was not comfortable. She was afraid that was what it would become, someone to take care of him. The logical next step, the thing the valley was already constructing around them without either of them being asked. The ranch and the farm folding into each other, her life folding into his, her independent existence becoming an appendage to the Boone operation, her identity shifting from Evelyn Harper, orchard owner, to Silas Boone's wife, helper, presence. She was afraid that was where this road led, and she was afraid that she was already far enough down it that the exit was behind her. She was also afraid, and this was the part she didn't let herself look at directly for very long, that she wanted it, wanted him, and that wanting it made her vulnerable to it happening in ways she hadn't agreed to. She lay in the dark for a long time. Tuesday came. She baked the pie. She opened the window at 7:55. At 8:03, she heard Copper on the trail. But this time, when she heard the hoofbeats change, slow, stop, she didn't feel the warmth she had been feeling. She felt the weight of Martha Calloway's hand on her arm and the words "take care of him" sitting in her chest like a stone. And when Silas knocked at the door and she opened it, the thing on her face was not quite what it had been the last several weeks. He saw it immediately. She watched him see it, the slight shift in his expression, the careful stillness that came over him like a man who has taken a step onto ice and is waiting to see if it holds. "Everything all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Come in." He came in. She poured the coffee. She cut the pie. She sat across from him and answered his questions about the east fence and the apple storage, and she was perfectly pleasant and perfectly present and perfectly precisely wrong in the way that anyone who had known her for more than a week would have been able to identify, and which she was hoping Silas Boone, who had known her for approximately 5 months of actual proximity, would not. He waited until she had refilled her own coffee and sat back down. Then he said, "What happened?" Not a question. The flat, patient statement of a man who had decided to wait out whatever this was and was fully prepared to sit here until it moved. She looked at her coffee cup. Nothing happened. Evelyn. Just her name again, the same way he had said it in December by the fence post. She looked up. "Martha Calloway said something to me in town," she said. He waited. She told him what Martha had said. She used the exact words because she was a precise person, and the exact words were the point, someone to take care of him. She watched his face while she said it, and watched the words land, and watched him think about them, and then watched him look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between understanding and something older and more tired. "She means well," he said. "I know she does," Evelyn said. "That's not the point." "What's the point?" She looked at him across the kitchen table. Her hands were flat on the wood, and her coffee was going cold, and outside the window the January light was that flat, pale, directionless light that Wyoming produces in winter like a particular kind of weather, all its own. "I built this farm," she said, "by myself, 5 years. I kept every account, fixed every fence, managed every harvest, made every decision. I didn't wait to be rescued, and I didn't need to be, and I am not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not looking for someone to need me. I have enough to do. And I am not willing to become a supporting character in someone else's story." The silence that followed was the longest one they'd had. Silas looked at her. She looked back. The January light sat on the table between them. "Is that what you think this is?" he said. "I don't know what this is," she said. "That's the problem." He put down his coffee cup. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might leave, might stand up and take his hat off the hook and say something careful and polite and ride back to his own property, and they would have to figure out how to be neighbors again from the beginning. And the thought of that landed in her chest with a specific gravity she was not prepared for. Instead, he said, "Margaret didn't need rescuing either." It was the first time she had heard him say his wife's name. She stayed completely still. "She ran that ranch with me, not for me," he said. "She had opinions about every decision we made, including the ones I thought I was making alone. She told me every time I was wrong, and she was right more often than not, and I knew it." He looked at the table. "When she died, I thought the hardest part was going to be the quiet. Turns out the hardest part was being the only one making the decisions." He looked up. "I don't need someone to take care of me," he said. "I need—" He stopped. She watched him struggle with the word and find it, and set it down carefully like something that might break. Company. The word sat between them. It was such a plain, unguarded human word that she felt her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely able to manage. "Silas," she said. "I know it's not simple," he said. "I know what people are already saying. I know what it would look like. I know you have a life here that you built and that doesn't need me in it." He picked up his coffee cup again, looked at it, set it down. "I'm not asking to be needed. I'm just—" Another pause. "I like your kitchen," he said. I like your coffee, and I like your pie, and I like talking to you, and I'm not real good at saying so, but I'm trying." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the pale January light shifted slightly, the way it does before noon when the sun is making a low effort. "Your coffee is terrible," she said. He blinked. "I've had it at your kitchen," she said, "when Noah brought me out to look at the east pasture in November. It's genuinely bad coffee." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It might have been the beginning of a smile. It was the closest she had seen to one since Christmas. "Noah makes the coffee." "Then Noah is the problem." "I'll tell him you said so." "Please do." She picked up her cup. "I'll teach him if you like." "He'd probably take that better from you than from me," Silas said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The stone that had been sitting in her chest since Thursday afternoon had not disappeared, and the things Martha Calloway had said had not stopped being true about the way other people saw them, and none of that was simple. But across the table from her was a man who had just said the most honest thing she had heard another person say in a very long time. And he had said it badly and without polish and with long pauses in the middle of it, and it had been more real for all of that. "Same time next Tuesday?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Same time next Tuesday." He finished his coffee, he put on his hat and his coat. At the door he paused and turned and said, without looking at her directly, in the voice of a man saying something he has been sitting on for a while, "For the record, you're not a supporting character." He left before she could answer. She stood in her kitchen with the January light coming through the window and the 2 cups on the table, and his boots having left cold mud on her floor by the door, and she let herself feel the full weight of that last sentence, which was more precisely what she had needed to hear than she had realized until he said it. She washed the cups. She swept the floor. She went out to check on the orchard, the way she always did, because the trees needed checking regardless of what was happening in the kitchen. The apple trees stood in their winter rows, bare and patient and deeply rooted, the way things that have survived hard winters do. She walked the rows and checked the bark and counted the buds that were already forming under the surface, invisible still, waiting for the right conditions. She walked all the way to the north end of the orchard, where the oldest tree stood, the one Silas had helped her prop up after the windstorm, the one he had said would take. And she put her hand on the bark the way she had in November, and she stood there for a moment in the January cold with her breath-making clouds in the air. The tree had taken, the roots had held. Under the bark, under the cold, whatever had needed to survive the winter was surviving it. She went back inside. She left the kitchen window cracked, the way she always did on Tuesdays, even in January, even in the cold. By the time the light went out of the day, she had already started planning what she would bake the following week. February came in hard that year. Not the dramatic, cinematic hard of blizzards and drifts that people in other parts of the country imagined when they thought about Wyoming winters, though those came too, eventually, but the grinding, relentless, bone-deep heart of cold that simply refused to move, that settled into the valley like an unwanted tenant and showed no interest in leaving. The kind of cold that makes livestock irritable and pipes unreliable, and people short with each other in ways they'll apologize for in April. Silas rode the fence line on Tuesdays anyway. He always had. The cold didn't change the fence's need to be inspected, and it didn't change the time he left. And it didn't change the fact that by the first week of February, he had stopped pretending to himself that the fence inspection was the primary reason he rode north on Tuesday mornings. He was not a man who lied to himself easily. He had tried it after Margaret died, had told himself for the first 6 months that he was fine, that the ranch was running well, that Noah was adjusting, that the particular quality of silence in the house at 6 in the morning when he came downstairs alone was something he was managing, and it had not worked, not even a little, and he had stopped trying it because it was exhausting on top of everything else. So he had learned to be honest with himself in the specific limited way of a man who knows that honesty costs something and pays anyway because the alternative is worse. He was honest with himself about Evelyn Harper. He had been since November, since the morning she had told him about the 2 years and 4 months, which had hit him somewhere he hadn't been hit in a long time and left a mark he was still figuring out what to do with. He liked her. He liked her more than he had liked anyone in a long time, in the complicated, inconvenient way of something real rather than something comfortable. She made him feel not young exactly. He was 51 years old, and winter had gotten into his knees in ways it hadn't 10 years ago, but present. Alert. Like a man who is paying attention to his own life again after several years of simply processing it. He had not told her this in those terms. He was not built for that kind of direct declaration, never had been, and Margaret had understood it and worked around it and occasionally called him on it with a precision that still made him smile sometimes when he thought about it. He communicated sideways, through fence wire and coffee and the specific effort of showing up on Thursdays when nothing required him to and saying nothing direct about why. He had always assumed that the people worth knowing would understand this about him. Evelyn Harper, he was finding, understood quite a lot. What she did not understand, or rather, what she had not seen yet, was the thing he carried into every Tuesday morning like a second coat, the weight that sat on him between her kitchen and his own, the specific nameless guilt of a man who was moving toward something new and could not fully convince himself that moving toward it wasn't a form of leaving. He had not told her about Margaret, not in any real way. He had said her name once in January when Evelyn had told him what Martha Calloway said, and that had been necessary. The story about Margaret and the ranch and the decisions had come out of him because the situation required it and because it was true. But the full weight of it, the room he had kept locked for 3 years, the anniversary dates he still couldn't get through without going very quiet, the way he sometimes stood in the barn at dusk for no reason he could name. None of that had come up. He was not sure how to bring it up. He was not sure, if he was being fully honest, that he was ready to. Noah knew. Noah had always known, because Noah had been there for all of it and had carried his own version of it, and they had learned to exist alongside each other's grief the way two people in a small house learn to move around shared furniture, carefully, with an awareness of where the edges were. What Noah had started doing in February was watching his father with a particular quality of attention that Silas recognized as inherited from Margaret, who had watched him the same way, with patience and intelligence and a willingness to wait for him to arrive at the thing on his own, combined with a clearly expressed readiness to name it herself if he took too long. He came home from the second Tuesday in February, and Noah was at the kitchen table doing his schoolwork and didn't look up when Silas came in, which meant he was paying close attention. Silas hung up his coat and washed his hands and started on the dinner, which was his job when Noah had schoolwork, and they were 20 minutes into a companionable silence before Noah said, still looking at his book, "You smell like apple pie." "I was at Evelyn's," Silas said. "I know." A pause. "You go every week." "It's Tuesday." "You went last Thursday, too." Silas turned from the stove. Noah was looking at him now with Margaret's eyes, which was occasionally difficult to deal with, and with his own 16-year-old expression layered over them, which made it more complicated. "The east gate hinge needed replacing," Silas said. Noah looked at him for a moment. "The east gate hinge has needed replacing for 2 years," he said. Silas turned back to the stove. There was a pause, and then Noah said, in a different tone, "Careful." The way he got when he was moving onto ground he wasn't sure of. "Dad, it's okay." Silas kept his attention on the pan. "I mean it," Noah said. "I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I like her. She's good. She's real. She doesn't treat me like a sad kid, and she doesn't pretend things are fine when they're not, and she makes better pie than anyone in the valley." He was quiet for a second. "Mom would have liked her." The pan needed stirring. Silas stirred it. "You don't have to act like nothing's changed," Noah said. "I can see that something's changed. I'm not 12. "I know you're not 12. So stop pretending." Silas set down the spoon. He stood at the stove with his back to his son and looked at the wall and took a breath that was slightly more deliberate than usual. "I'm not pretending," he said. "I'm just—" He stopped. The word he wanted was the same one he had used with Evelyn in January, the plain, unguarded word that had been true then and was still true. Figuring. He was figuring. He was trying to move through something that didn't have clear footing without knocking anything over that couldn't be picked up again. "I know," Noah said. And then, "She's not going anywhere. She's been there every Tuesday for 2 years before you even stopped. She's not the kind of person who goes anywhere." Silas picked up the spoon again. After dinner, when Noah had gone back to his books and the kitchen was clean, Silas sat in his chair in the front room. Not Margaret's chair. He had never sat in Margaret's chair. It still had her shape to it from years of use, and he was not ready for that. And he sat with his coffee going cold beside him and thought about what his son had said. She's not the kind of person who goes anywhere. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about the way Evelyn moved through her own property, with authority, with ease, with the particular confidence of a woman who owned the ground she was standing on and knew it. He thought about January and what she had said. I am not willing to become a supporting character in someone else's story. He thought about how that sentence had landed in him, not as a warning, though it was that too, but as something that clarified, something that told him exactly what kind of person he was dealing with and made him want to deal with her more rather than less. He sat in his chair and he thought about Margaret. He did this deliberately, which was different from the way he had been doing it for 3 years, which was involuntarily and at inconvenient moments. He thought about her on purpose, the specific version of her he needed to think about, which was the version that had sat across from him at their own kitchen table for 18 years, and told him the truth when he needed it, and left him alone when that was what he needed, and always known which was which. What would she say? If she were here? If she could see the past 3 months? He sat with that question for a while. He didn't hear an answer because the dead don't answer, but he knew Margaret well enough that he could construct a reasonable approximation. She would not have wanted this. The locked room, the closed quality of his days, the way he had been managing rather than living. She had been a woman of great practicality, and she had told him once, early in their marriage, when he had asked what she would want if something happened to her, that she would want him to stop being an idiot about things that didn't require it. He almost laughed at the memory. The almost laugh surprised him. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, drank it anyway. The locked room was at the end of the upstairs hall. He had not opened the door in 14 months. Before that, he had opened it occasionally, on specific days, to sit inside it for a while with the specific quality of aloneness it offered. But 14 months ago, he had come out of it and pulled the door shut behind him, and something in him had said, "Not yet." He didn't know what he was waiting for. He still didn't know. But sitting in his chair in the February dark, he thought that whatever it was might be getting closer. The break happened on a Tuesday in the last week of February, and it happened in the way that breaks do, not with dramatic confrontation or raised voices or any of the mechanisms of conflict that people in retrospect want to be able to point to as the moment. It happened quietly in the space between a thing said and a thing understood. The Valley's opinion had been building since January. Doris Henderson had mentioned it to the Reverend. The Reverend had mentioned it to the Calloway family at their Sunday lunch. Martha Calloway had mentioned it to at least 4 other households in the way that Martha mentioned things, which was thoroughgoing and well-intentioned and impossible to stop once started. By the end of February, the Valley had not merely noticed what was happening between Silas Boone and Evelyn Harper, it had developed a narrative about it, complete with projected timeline and expected outcome, and this narrative had been reaching both of them in the way that all community narratives reach their subjects. Indirectly, repeatedly, and without being asked for. For Silas, it had taken a specific form, delivered by a specific person, and it had lodged in him in a way he hadn't been able to shake for 2 weeks before the Tuesday it came out. Tom Garrett, who ran the biggest cattle operation in the valley and had known Silas for 20 years, had said it to him at the feed store on a Wednesday morning in early February with the casual authority of a man who considered himself a friend. You know, if you're serious about this, you ought to be thinking about what makes sense practically. Her land and yours together would be a solid operation. She's been running that farm on her own long enough. Makes sense for everyone. Silas had said nothing. He had paid for his feed and loaded his wagon and driven home, and he had not told Noah, and he had not said anything to Evelyn on the following Tuesday because he did not know how to say it without it becoming something larger than a thing. One man said at a feed store. And he did not want it to become something larger because he already knew, if he looked at it directly, that it bothered him in a way that told him something true about himself. It bothered him because there was a part of him, a small, uncomfortable part, that he would not have admitted to quickly. That had thought something similar. Not in Tom Garrett's terms, not in the practical language of consolidated land operations, but in a vaguer and more complicated version of the same thought. It would make sense. It would simplify. Two properties becoming one household would be efficient, would solve certain logistical difficulties, would give Noah a more settled home situation, would give Silas someone to eat breakfast with. He had thought those things. He knew he had. And he was honest enough with himself to know that they were the wrong reasons, or at least not enough of the right reasons, and that Evelyn Harper would see through to that in approximately 30 seconds if he let her anywhere near it. So he had been carrying it for 2 weeks, and it had been making him quieter and more careful than usual, and Evelyn had noticed, she noticed everything, but had said nothing, which was its own kind of tension, the tension of two careful people noticing the same thing and waiting each other out. The Tuesday it broke was cold and gray, and the pie was a little overcooked, not badly, just the edge of the crust gone a shade darker than it should have been, and Silas had been at the table for 20 minutes, not quite saying what he needed to say, when Evelyn set down her cup and said, "Whatever it is, just say it." He looked at her. "You've been somewhere else for 2 weeks," she said. "I've been waiting for you to come back on your own, and you're not coming back on your own, so." He looked at the table. He told her what Tom Garrett had said. He used the exact words, "Her land and yours together would be a solid operation," because Evelyn was a precise person, and the exact words were the point, just as they had been with Martha Calloway in January. He watched her face while he said them, and watched the familiar controlled stillness come over it, the expression she made when something landed badly and she was deciding how to respond to it. Then he told her the rest. The part he had not intended to tell her, because it required more honesty than he had been planning on. The part about his own version of the same thought, the efficiency calculation, the breakfast table, the logistical convenience. He said it badly. He knew he was saying it badly even while he was saying it, and he kept going anyway because stopping in the middle would have been worse. When he finished, there was a silence that had a specific texture to it, heavier than the usual silences between them. Evelyn was looking at the window. Her coffee cup was in front of her, and she wasn't touching it. "So you've been thinking about it," she said. Her voice was level. The practical version. "I've been thinking about it in a way that bothered me," he said, "which is different." She looked at him. "It bothered me because I know those aren't the right reasons," he said. "And I know that if I ever said something like that to you, you would—" He stopped. "You have built something here that is yours, not ours, not anyone else's. And any version of whatever this is that treats your farm like a piece of a larger puzzle is not a version I want to be part of." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. "Tom Garrett has been married to the same woman for 31 years, she said finally. She was running her father's horse operation when he met her. Inside of 2 years, it was the Garrett horse operation. You notice they don't call it that anymore." She picked up her cup. "Nobody does it on purpose. It just becomes the shape of things." "I know," he said. "Do you?" She looked at him directly. "Because I don't think you do, entirely. I don't think you can, entirely, because you're not the one who disappears in that version. I'm the one who disappears." The weight of that sentence sat between them. "I am not disappearing," she said. "I will not disappear. If that's a problem—" "It's not a problem," he said. "Silas, Evelyn, it is not a problem." He said it with a firmness that was different from his usual measured tone, something more direct, something that had apparently been waiting behind the carefulness for a while. "I am not Tom Garrett. I am not looking to absorb your operation into mine. I am not interested in the land." He paused. "I'm interested in you. The specific you who built this farm and fixes her own fence and makes bad coffee in the evenings and doesn't know it because you're used to your own." She blinked. "My coffee is not bad." "It's not as bad as Noah's," he said. "That's not the same as good." Something shifted on her face. The controlled stillness cracked just slightly at the edge, and underneath it was something that might have been the beginning of relief. She looked at her cup. She looked at him. "I don't know where this goes," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't have a picture of it." "Neither do I," he said. "That doesn't bother you?" He considered this. He was quiet long enough that she would have known he was actually considering it, not just preparing a reassuring answer. "It does," he said. "I'm better with a clear picture than without one. Always have been." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "But I've been learning that some pictures you can't make ahead of time. You have to be in the thing first." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the gray February light sat over the orchard, over the bare apple trees, over the propped-up tree at the north end that was carrying its winter the way it had carried the windstorm. Not gracefully, but stubbornly, with the specific persistence of something rooted too deep to be moved by one bad season. "Same time next Tuesday," she said. "Same time next Tuesday," he said. He left at 9:15. He got on Copper and rode back along the north fence line, and the cold was sharp enough to sting where his scarf didn't cover, and he rode through it without hurrying, and when he got back to the ranch, he put Copper up in the barn and stood in the barn for a while in the smell of hay and cold and horse, and thought about the conversation he had just had. He had said things today he had not said before. He had said them badly in places and adequately in others, and he had said them without planning to, and that was probably, he thought, the most honest they had ever been with each other in 5 months of increasingly honest mornings. He stood in the barn and thought about Evelyn's face when the stillness had cracked, just slightly, just at the edge, and thought about the propped-up apple tree, and about Noah saying she's not the kind of person who goes anywhere. He went inside. Noah had left breakfast on the stove. He sat down and ate it and did not say anything about where he'd been, and Noah didn't ask. And the kitchen was warm. And outside, the February cold held the valley in its grip and showed no signs of moving, but things were moving. Quietly, slowly underneath, the way they do in winter, the way roots do, invisibly and with great patience and towards something that hasn't shown itself above the surface yet, but is coming all the same. March arrived and thawed the valley in stages, grudgingly, the way Wyoming releases winter, not all at once, but incrementally, day by day, giving back the color and the sound of moving water and the particular quality of mud that means the ground is remembering how to be soft again. With the thaw came new logistics, as it always did, fence sections that had heaved in the frost, drainage that needed clearing, the apple trees budding visibly now at the tips of every branch, so that the orchard had a faint green haze to it when the light hit a certain way in the late afternoon. Evelyn had more to do in March than in any other month, except harvest, and she did it with the focused efficiency of a woman who had done it alone for 5 years and had the sequence of it memorized in her hands. What was different about March this year was that on 2 Thursdays, without being specifically asked, Silas showed up and helped. He didn't ask if she needed help. He didn't offer. He arrived with his tools in the wagon on the first Thursday, took a look at the fence section she was working on, and went to the far end and started from the other direction, so they were working toward each other rather than her working the whole thing alone. They met in the middle at noon, and she handed him the lunch she had packed for one, and he ate half of it without comment, and she pretended this had been the plan all along, and neither of them said a word about it. The second Thursday was the drainage clearing, which was miserable work in wet cold and required getting into the ditch at the east field, and he arrived again without announcement and climbed into the ditch with her, and they worked side by side for 3 hours in mud and cold water up to their ankles, and by the end of it, they were both comprehensively filthy, and she was going to lose a boot to the mud on the south side of the ditch, and he pulled it free for her with a sound that sent a crow off a nearby fence post in alarm, and they looked at each other covered in March mud, and she laughed again. That same laugh from Christmas, unplanned and genuine and slightly rusty. And this time he laughed too. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a short sound, quiet, not the big expansive laugh of a man who laughed easily, but real, and it changed his whole face for the 3 seconds it lasted, and she stored it somewhere careful. Noah started coming on Saturdays. This was not arranged and not discussed. It began because Evelyn had mentioned once in passing that she needed to get the pruning done on the orchard before the budding went too far, and Noah had shown up the following Saturday with his coat and his work gloves and had spent 4 hours pruning apple trees with more competence than she had expected from a teenager, and she had paid him a fair wage and fed him lunch, the same as always. But something was different about this Saturday than the previous Saturdays he had worked for her, and she thought she understood what it was. He was choosing to be here. Not for the money, or not only for the money, but because he wanted to. Because this kitchen table and this orchard and this particular Saturday morning arrangement was something he was building toward on his own account, separate from whatever his father was or wasn't doing. She thought about what he had said in the fall. I like her. She doesn't treat me like a sad kid. She tried to think about what it must have been. The 3 years, the house with the locked room, his father going through the motions. She was careful not to make assumptions. She had not been in that house, and she did not know the specific shape of their grief together. But she had seen Noah's face at the Christmas table, and she had heard the way he talked about his father sleeping in, and she understood enough. He was 17 in March. He had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and a quality of steadiness that was his own. Something he had developed, she thought, not inherited. Something earned. She taught him the pruning sequence one section at a time, explaining the reasoning behind each cut, and he listened with the same focused attention his father brought to everything. And he asked good questions, and by the afternoon he was working a section on his own with more accuracy than she had seen from grown men twice his age. "You're good at this," she told him. He looked at the branch he had just cut. "I like that you can see what you're doing," he said. "Like, the tree tells you where to cut. You just have to learn how to read it." She looked at him. "Your father said something like that to me once, about looking carefully." Noah smiled. A rare full smile, the kind that was usually slightly held back. "He says that about a lot of things." "Does he?" she said. "Yeah." Noah went back to his work. After a moment, "He talks about you, at home, just, in the normal way, like you're already part of things." She kept her eyes on the branch she was working. "What does he say?" "He said you're the most stubborn person he's ever met," Noah said, with a tone that conveyed this was being reported as a compliment. "And that you make worse coffee than you think you do." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He said that." "Last Tuesday, at dinner." Noah looked sideways at her. He was kind of smiling when he said it. She pruned 3 more branches before she trusted herself to say anything. Then, "He doesn't smile easily." "No," Noah agreed. "He doesn't." He paused. "He used to, before. He used to do it more." He said it without self-pity, as a plain statement of fact. "He's starting to again." She did not say anything to that. She didn't need to. She went back to her pruning, and Noah went back to his, and the orchard was quiet around them except for the sound of tools and the occasional bird and the specific quality of late March air that smells like possibility even before anything has actually opened. The 3rd week of March was when Silas finally opened the door. He did not plan it. He had gotten up at 5:30 as usual, made coffee, stood in the kitchen for a moment in the gray pre-dawn thinking about the day's work, and then found himself in the upstairs hall outside the door at the end of it, with no clear memory of deciding to walk there. He stood in front of it for a while. He put his hand on the door frame, not the handle. The wood was cold. He had not cried in front of Noah after the funeral. He had cried once, alone in the barn, 3 days after, and that had been the last time, because after that there had been too much to do, and crying required a kind of stillness he hadn't been able to afford. He had managed. He had kept going. He had done what needed doing. He put his hand on the handle. He opened the door. The room was cold and dark and smelled of dust and something older, some specific combination of things. Cedar from the chest, wool from the blankets, something he could not name that was not a smell exactly, but a quality of the air in that particular room that hit him like a physical thing. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not go in. He was not ready to go in. But he stood in the doorway and he looked at the room, at the shape of it in the dark, at the chest under the window and the chair in the corner and the hook on the wall where a coat still hung, and he let himself feel the full weight of what was in that room without the management, without the careful containment, without the 3 years of practiced distance. It was not a manageable feeling. It was large and ragged, and it had edges he had been avoiding for 14 months, and it was, when he finally let himself face it without the distance, exactly as hard as he had thought it would be. He stood in the doorway, and he felt it. He stood there until the sky through the window at the end of the hall started going gray with early morning, and then he pulled the door closed again. Gently, not locked, just closed, and he went downstairs and put on his coat and went out to do the morning chores, because the animals needed feeding regardless of what was happening in the upstairs hall, and the world had not stopped, and he was still in it. He did not feel better exactly. He was not sure that was the right measure. He felt emptied in the way that a space feels after something has been moved out of it. Not clean, not resolved, just opened in some necessary way, like drainage cleared so that what needed to move could eventually move. He thought about Evelyn while he fed the horses. He thought about the apple tree in her orchard. the one they had propped up together in the fall, the one that had taken. He thought about the March buds on it. He had seen them last Tuesday through the kitchen window, faint and green and insistent. He went inside and made coffee. Noah's bad coffee, which he had apparently been making badly for 3 years without it ever once occurring to him to ask anyone why. And he sat at the kitchen table and drank it and thought about what came next, not in the large, terrifying sense of the whole future, but in the small, manageable sense of Tuesday. Tuesday, he would ride north. Tuesday, he would smell the pie through the trees. Tuesday, he would stop at the fence post and knock at the door and come into the kitchen that he had come to know so well over the past months. The cold mud by the door, the 2 cups on the table, the window cracked even in the cold. And Evelyn would be there, in her kitchen, on her farm, which was hers and would remain hers. And she would hand him coffee that was better than his, and they would sit across from each other and talk about the east fence and the apple trees and the spring work and all the practical necessary things. And underneath all of it, like roots under winter ground, would be the thing that neither of them said in plain language, but that both of them knew was there, growing in the way things grow when you stop standing in their light. He was afraid. He was still afraid. Fear did not stop being fear because you had identified it. He had learned that the hard way and more than once. But he also knew, in the way that a man who has opened a door for the first time in 14 months knows things, that fear and courage were not opposites. Sometimes they were the same thing wearing different coats, and the difference was only in whether you moved your feet. He finished his coffee. He washed the cup. He left it on the counter next to the one he would need for tomorrow morning and went out to start the day. The Tuesday after Silas opened the door, he was late. Not by much. 11 minutes, which by the standards of a man who had ridden the same fence line at the same time every Tuesday for going on 3 years, was the equivalent of another person being an hour off. But Evelyn noticed it the way she noticed everything about Tuesday mornings, which was immediately and without being able to pretend otherwise. She had the pie out at 7:55, the window cracked at 8, and at 8:11 she was standing at the counter with her back carefully turned to the window and her hands doing something unnecessary with the dish towel when she heard Copper on the trail. She was at the table with her coffee by the time he knocked. He looked different. She couldn't have said exactly how. He was wearing the same coat, the same hat, the same expression of careful composure he brought to everything. But there was something in the quality of him that morning that was different from the previous several weeks, something less tightly held, like a knot that has been worked at and has given slightly without coming undone. She noticed it and said nothing about it, and poured his coffee, and they sat down and she waited. He told her about the door. Not in those exact terms. Silas did not, as a rule, say I opened the door to my dead wife's room last week and stood there in the dark until sunrise with that kind of directness. What he said was closer to, there was a room he hadn't been in. He had opened it. He was not ready to say more than that, and she should not read it as a resolution because it wasn't one. It was more like the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. She listened without interrupting. She had learned, over the past months, that interrupting Silas Boone when he was saying something difficult was like stepping on ice that was just beginning to hold. It would take the weight if you were still, and crack if you moved wrong. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. That took courage, she said. He shook his head slightly. It took being tired enough of not doing it. That's the same thing, she said. Usually? He looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them that she would not have been able to describe precisely, and that she thought he probably couldn't either. Some acknowledgement that didn't need words and would have been made smaller by them. She cut him a second slice of pie without asking. He ate it without comment. They talked about the spring fence work and the drainage on the east field and the progress of the apple buds, and it was the most ordinary Tuesday morning conversation possible, and it was also not ordinary at all. And when he left at 9, he put his hat on in the doorway and paused the same way he sometimes paused. The way she had learned meant he had something to say that he was still deciding whether to say. The room, he said, not looking at her. Margaret's things are in it, some of them. He put his hand on the doorframe. I thought you should know that. Where I am with it. So you're not working with incomplete information. She understood what it had cost him to say that. She understood it precisely. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and went to Copper and rode back up the north trail. And she stood in her kitchen doorway and watched him go, and then went to check the apple trees because the trees needed checking and because she needed something to do with the fullness of what had just happened. April in Wyoming arrives as a negotiation rather than a declaration. The cold doesn't leave so much as it agrees, reluctantly, to share. The days went warm enough to work in shirt sleeves by noon and cold enough for frost by midnight, and Evelyn moved through the orchard in layers, peeling them off and adding them back depending on the hour and the cloud cover and the specific temperature of the wind coming down off the mountain. The apple trees were fully budding now, and then flowering, and the orchard in the morning had a smell to it that was almost aggressive in its sweetness, the way spring smells always are after a long winter, insistent, slightly overwhelming, like something that has been waiting and is done with waiting. She was in the orchard on a Thursday morning, working the section nearest the north fence, when she heard a horse and looked up expecting Copper, and saw instead a horse she didn't recognize, a brown mare she had not seen before, ridden by a woman she recognized with the particular stomach drop of someone spotting a problem before they can name it. Catherine Wills was 44 years old and had been widowed the previous spring when her husband had been thrown from a horse. She was dark-haired and fine-featured and ran a small but well-kept sheep operation on the valley's east side. And she had been, by the account of several reliable sources, including Doris Henderson, who had several times used the phrase very attentive, spending a fair amount of time in the vicinity of Silas Boone's ranch since the fall. Evelyn had heard this from Doris in January and had filed it in the category of valley information she did not need and had not thought about it again with any seriousness. There was no arrangement between herself and Silas that excluded anything, no stated claim, no explicit conversation in which either of them had named what was happening between them with sufficient precision to constitute any kind of agreement about anything. She was aware of this now in a way she had not been aware of it in January. Catherine pulled her horse up at the fence line and smiled. A genuine smile, nothing calculated in it, which Evelyn noted because it made the situation more complicated rather than less. "Mrs. Harper, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Evelyn said. The pruning knife was in her hand. She did not put it down. "Can I help you with something?" "I was just riding the East Trail," Catherine said. "I thought I'd stop and ask. I know you sell apples in the fall. Do you take orders in advance? I used to get them from the Miller farm, but they're not planting this year." It was a completely reasonable request. Evelyn provided the information, yes, orders in September, half payment in advance, delivery or pickup, in a completely reasonable tone, and Catherine thanked her in a completely reasonable way. And then Catherine said, in the bright conversational tone of someone who is being friendly and nothing more, "I saw Silas Boone in town on Wednesday. He mentioned he'd been helping out with your East field work. He's a good man to have around." The words were ordinary. The words were so ordinary that there was nothing to respond to, nothing to push back against, nothing to disagree with. He was a good man to have around. This was not incorrect. Catherine had said it in a way that suggested she knew it personally, had some basis for the assessment beyond general valley opinion, and had offered it naturally, without edge, in the way of a woman who had nothing to hide because she did not believe she was hiding anything. Evelyn looked at Catherine Wills on her brown mare, with the April morning behind her and the apple blossoms doing their aggressive best in the orchard, and said, with the composure of 5 years of managing her own everything, "He is." Catherine smiled again, said goodbye, and rode back the way she had come, and Evelyn watched her go and then stood in the orchard for a solid minute doing nothing at all. Then she went back to pruning, because the trees did not care about Catherine Wills. She did not mention it on the following Tuesday. She sat across from Silas at the kitchen table and had her coffee and her pie, and talked about the apple blossom count on the north section and the drainage improvement from the March work, and she did not say one word about Catherine Wills, and she was proud of her own composure, and also, underneath the composure, not entirely comfortable with what the composure was covering. The thing it was covering was not jealousy, exactly. She examined it carefully over the following days, in the way she examined all things she was uncertain about, directly, without flinching, with the intention of knowing the truth whether she liked it or not. It was not jealousy in the simple territorial sense. She did not own Silas Boone. She had no claim on him, and had never said she did, and would not have said it because it would have required a kind of conversation they had not yet had. What it was, when she looked at it without the management, was closer to fear of her own assumptions. She had been assuming, without acknowledging that she was assuming, that the shape of what was between them was singular. That he rode to her farmhouse on Tuesdays and came on Thursdays and was building something with her that was the primary thing he was building. She had not said this. He had not said this. She had simply been assuming it in the way you assume a path continues in the direction you've been walking until you find out it doesn't. Catherine Wills had not told her the path turned. Catherine Wills had said nothing alarming, but Evelyn was an honest woman, and honesty required her to admit that the appearance of Catherine Wills had shown her that she was operating on an assumption she had never tested, and that was her own fault, and that she needed to decide what to do about it. She spent 3 days deciding. By Saturday, when Noah arrived for his orchard work, she had arrived at a position. She would say something. She did not know exactly what. She was not going to issue ultimatums or make demands or deploy any of the dramatic mechanisms of the kind of conversation she had been avoiding, because those were not tools she respected and were not going to get her the thing she actually needed, which was clarity. Noah was halfway through his lunch before he noticed something was off. He was perceptive in the way his father was perceptive, the kind that operates quietly and then produces a conclusion with no visible process. And he set down his fork and looked at her with his mother's eyes and said, "What's wrong?" Not a question. The same flat, patient statement she had heard from his father in January. She looked at this 17-year-old boy across her kitchen table and thought about how to answer him, and decided on the truth, because she had never talked to Noah as though he was less than capable of handling truth, and she was not going to start now. "I'm trying to figure out where I stand," she said, "with your father." Noah was very still for a moment. Then he picked up his fork again. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't know what we are to each other," she said. "We haven't said it, and I don't know if not saying it means it isn't something, or if it means we're both being careful." Noah ate a bite of his lunch. He chewed it. He was thinking in the deliberate, thorough way he did everything, and she waited him out. "He talks about you," he said finally. "Not like—" He made a gesture with his fork that managed to convey not the way men talk about women in general. "Like you're someone he's worked something out with. Like you're already, I don't know. Like you're already in the thing." "The thing," she said. "His life." Noah looked at her. "He doesn't talk about things that aren't real to him. He doesn't do that. So if he talks about you—" He stopped. "What did Catherine Wills say to you?" She stared at him. "How did you—" "She was at the ranch last fall," he said. "Twice. Dad was polite." His expression made clear what weight he was assigning to the word polite. "The second time she left, he was just tired looking, like he'd been trying to explain something and it hadn't worked." Evelyn absorbed this. "He's not interested in Catherine Wills," Noah said, with the particular certainty of a teenager who knows exactly one thing for sure and is sure about it. "He's been interested in you for so long, it's kind of—" He stopped himself, reconsidered. "You should talk to him." "I know," she said. "I mean, actually talk to him," Noah said. "Not the pie and the fence and the—" He waved the fork again. "The other talking." She looked at him. "When did you get this direct?" "I've always been this direct," he said, and went back to his lunch, and she thought, yes, he had been, from the first time he sat at this table and ate her pie and told her his father mentioned her fence. She had simply been too busy looking at his father to notice. She said it on Tuesday. She had been planning to, and then the morning arrived and the pie was ready, and Silas knocked at the door and they sat down, and the conversation went to the East Field, and then the apple count, and then 20 minutes passed without her having said the thing she needed to say, and she stopped herself in the middle of something about the north section drainage and said, "I need to say something." He set down his cup. He gave her the full attention. No partial attention with Silas. When he listened, he was all the way there. "I don't know what this is," she said, "what we are. And I've been not asking because I didn't want to push something that wasn't ready, and because I'm careful about certain things, and you know that. But I've been not asking for long enough that I'm starting to build assumptions I haven't told you about, and that's not fair to either of us." He was quiet. Catherine Wills stopped by my orchard, she said. Something moved across his face. When? Thursday before last. He was quiet for a moment. She comes by the ranch sometimes, he said. I haven't encouraged it. I'm not accusing you of anything, Evelyn said. That's not what this is about. What this is about is that I realized I've been assuming that what happens in this kitchen on Tuesdays is singular. For you, the way it is for me. And I have never once asked you if that's true. He looked at her for a long moment. The April morning light was different from February light, softer, with more movement in it, and it came through the window and lay across the kitchen table between them. Evelyn, he said. Silas. It's singular, he said. Without hesitation, without qualification, without the pauses he usually took before the things that mattered. There is nowhere else I'm going on Tuesday, or Thursday, or any other day I come here. He looked at his hands on the table. There has not been anyone else since Margaret, not because I was waiting for someone specific. I didn't think there was going to be someone, but because there wasn't anyone I wanted to sit across a table from. He looked up. Then there was. She felt the heat climb her face. She was 47 years old, and she felt the heat climb her face the same way she had in November when the words had come out without her permission, and she decided she was not going to look away from it this time. Then you need to say that, she said. Not just to me. You need to make it clear. Because people are filling in the space where the clarity ought to be, and not always in ways that are helpful. He nodded slowly. You're right. I know I'm right. She picked up her cup. I'm usually right. You're going to have to get used to that. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was the beginning of a smile, the same small movement she had cataloged since Christmas. I've noticed, he said. Good. She set down the cup. Then we understand each other. We understand each other, he said. They drank their coffee. The kitchen was quiet in the April morning, warm from the oven, smelling of cinnamon and apple, and the faint green smell of spring coming through the cracked window. She thought about what he had said. Then there was, and how plain it was, and how much weight it carried for being so plain. And she thought it was maybe the most Silas Boone sentence she had ever heard him say, which was to say, entirely honest, very short, and more than enough. The following Saturday he came with Noah. This had not been the plan. Noah arrived first, at his usual time, and then an hour later Silas pulled the wagon up to the gate and came into the orchard where they were working the south section, and he did not have a specific announced purpose for being there. He simply came and found a task that needed doing and did it, and by noon all three of them were in the orchard, and the work was going faster than Evelyn had managed alone in 5 springs. She noticed the way Noah watched his father move through the orchard. There was something in Noah's face on those Saturdays, a quality of relaxation, of allowed ease, that she associated with the relief she had seen when he first noticed the 2 coffee cups on the table. As though the orchard and the 3 of them in it together was a version of things he had been hoping for and was still slightly surprised to find himself inside. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, which was becoming its own kind of pattern. Silas had started bringing things. A jar of preserved meat from the previous fall, a pound of decent coffee that was better than what he made at home, once a small bag of early spring potatoes from the root cellar. He didn't announce these contributions. He set them on the counter when he came in and said nothing about them, and Evelyn said nothing about them either, and they accumulated on her kitchen shelves the way evidence accumulates, quietly, without drama, simply by existing. After lunch, Noah went back to the south section, and Evelyn and Silas sat over their coffee, and she said, "He's different out here." Silas looked out the window at where Noah was visible moving through the trees. "Yeah," he said. "At home," she started. "He takes care of things," Silas said. "At home. Since Margaret. He's been—" He stopped. Turned the cup in his hands the way he did when he was working toward something. "He's been older than he should have had to be." "I know," she said quietly. "He's 17, Silas said. He should be able to just—" He stopped again. She waited. "I should have done better by him," he said. "The last 3 years. I was present. I was there, but I wasn't—" He shook his head. "You were grieving," she said. "He was too." She looked at Silas across the table, at this man who had managed a ranch and a teenage son and 3 years of loss and a fence line every Tuesday morning, and who was now sitting at her kitchen table quietly holding himself accountable for the ways grief had made him less than he wanted to be. And she felt something that was not pity and was not sympathy exactly, but was close to both of them, and also something more, something she was running out of ways to avoid naming. "He told me something last Saturday," she said. "He said you talk about me at home. Like I'm already in the thing. His word." Silas looked at her. "I think he's right," she said. "I think I'm already in the thing, and I think you are too. And I think we've been being very careful about it for very understandable reasons, but I want to stop being careful about naming it, at least between the two of us, because I am too old and too practical to keep tiptoeing around something I know is true." He was very still. "I love this farm," she said. "I love this orchard, and this kitchen, and the life I have built here, and I am not giving any of it up. And I have been clear about that, and you have been clear about understanding it, and I believe you. But I am also," she took a breath, said it plain, "I am in love with you. I don't know what to do with that exactly. I don't have a plan for it, but it's true, and I'm tired of it being the thing we're both sitting around." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a man who had just been given something he had been moving toward for months, and was not entirely sure his hands were ready for it. He said, "Evelyn." "I know," she said. "Take your time." He was quiet for long enough that she almost said something to fill it, and then he said, "I opened that door 3 weeks ago, the room." He looked at his hands on the table. "I've gone back twice since then. I still can't go in, but I can open it now." He looked up. "I'm telling you because I need you to know where I am. I need you to know that what I feel," he stopped. "What I feel for you is real. It's not comfortable or easy, and I'm not done being afraid of it, but it's real. And I don't say that kind of thing for something I'm not sure of." She looked at him. 47 years old, flour on her sleeve from the morning baking, the April light coming through the window, the apple trees outside doing their insistent spring business. "I know you don't," she said. "So," he said. "So," she said. They sat with it for a moment, the thing finally named, sitting between them on the kitchen table alongside the coffee cups and the half-finished pie, solid and slightly terrifying and real. Then Evelyn said, "Your coffee is getting cold." He looked at his cup, looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. He drank his coffee. Outside, Noah moved through the orchard rows, pruning with the accuracy she had taught him, and the apple trees stood in their April flowering, and the morning held all 3 of them in it, without requiring any of them to be more than what they were. The week after that conversation, something shifted in the valley's understanding of them, though neither of them had made any announcement and did not plan to. It shifted because people see what they see, and what the valley saw was Silas Boone's wagon outside Evelyn Harper's gate on a Saturday morning with some regularity, and Evelyn Harper's wave to him in town on a Wednesday that was different in quality from the wave of a neighbor, and Noah Boone at the feed store telling Robert Henderson without any particular self-consciousness that he'd spent the morning at Mrs. Harper's place, which was information Robert passed to Doris before noon. Doris Henderson revised her account of the situation. Martha Calloway revised hers. The valley, which had been constructing a narrative around them since January, found that the narrative had caught up with the reality, or rather that the reality had grown into the space the narrative had been holding open. Not everyone in the valley was entirely comfortable with the revision. There were those who had opinions about the appropriate timing of such things, about respect owed to the memory of Margaret Boone, about what Evelyn Harper was doing with that farm and that man, and whether it all amounted to something proper. These opinions were expressed in the particular way of valley opinion, indirectly, through inference, through the quality of certain silences at certain social occasions, and reached Silas and Evelyn the same way all such opinions reached them, which was inevitably. Silas dealt with it the way he dealt with most external pressure, which was to say, he didn't. He was not a man who organized his decisions around other people's comfort with them. He had learned this about himself early and confirmed it repeatedly, and the quality of the look he gave Robert Henderson when Robert Henderson made a remark at the feed store in late April that required a response was sufficient that Robert Henderson did not make a similar remark again. Evelyn dealt with it differently, in the way she always dealt with things that required management, which was directly. When Martha Calloway found her at the dry goods store again in late April, same bolt of fabric, different expression, less warmly certain and more carefully curious, Evelyn let her say what she needed to say and then said pleasantly and without room for misunderstanding, "I appreciate your concern, Martha. I want to be clear that my farm is my farm, and Silas Boone's ranch is his ranch, and anything beyond that is between the two of us and not a matter I'll be discussing at the dry goods store." Martha looked at her for a moment, then, "Of course," she said. "Of course. I know," Evelyn said. "Thank you for the apple order." She paid for her fabric and left. She told Silas about it on Tuesday because she had decided she was not going to stop telling him things that were relevant to their situation, and because she wanted to know his response, and also because she was honest enough to admit that the look on Martha Calloway's face had been mildly satisfying, and she wanted to tell someone about it. His response was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one she had seen outside of the Christmas laugh and the mud-in-the-ditch moment, and it lasted longer than usual, and she stored it in the same careful place she had stored the other ones and thought that she was accumulating quite a collection. "You didn't need to say anything to her," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was true, and it was clear, and now she knows it." He looked at her. "Is that how you handle most things?" "Yes," she said. "Is that going to be a problem?" He considered it for longer than was strictly necessary, which she recognized as a performance of consideration rather than actual uncertainty, and then said, "No." "Good," she said. May arrived, and the valley turned green with the particular conviction that Wyoming green has after a long winter, almost aggressive, deeply saturated, insisting on itself after months of gray and brown. The apple trees were past flowering and into the early forming of fruit now, small and hard and full of future, and the orchard work shifted from flowering care to fruit development, which required different attention and more patience. Evelyn walked her orchard rows every evening in May, checking the developing fruit, counting the clusters, making the notes in her ledger that would inform the harvest planning in the fall. She had done this every May for 5 years. This May felt different in the way that the Tuesdays had felt different since November. Structurally identical, experientially altered, the same path walked with something added to it that changed the quality of the walking. One evening in the second week of May, she was at the north end of the orchard, checking the oldest tree, the windstorm tree, the propped-up one that had taken, and she heard a horse on the trail and looked up, and it was Copper, and it was 6 in the evening, which was not Tuesday, and Silas came through the gate with no stated reason for being there. She looked at him. He looked at her, and then at the tree. "It's loaded," he said, meaning the fruit clusters on the old tree. More than the other trees, more than she had expected. "I know," she said. "I don't know if the branches will hold it all." He walked up to the tree and looked at the branches the way he looked at things, fully, carefully, with the assessment of a man who had spent his life looking at what things could carry. He put his hand on the main branch and tested it gently. "It'll hold," he said. She looked at the tree. She looked at him. "You said that before," she said, "about this same tree, in the fall." "I was right then," he said. "You were," she said. He kept his hand on the branch. She stood beside him in the May evening in her orchard with the green all around them, and the fruit developing on the trees and the north fence line solid and repaired in the distance, and thought about 2 years and 4 months of Tuesday mornings and where they had arrived, which was here, standing next to each other in the evening light, easy in the way that only actual familiarity produces, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "I went into the room," he said. She was still. "Last week," he said. "I went in. I sat in the chair." He looked at the tree. "I stayed for about an hour." He removed his hand from the branch. "I'm not going to say it wasn't. I'm not going to make it sound neat." "I know," she said. "But I went in," he said, "and I came out again." He looked at her. "And I came here." She understood what he was telling her. Not a resolution. He had said that in the kitchen months ago, that it wasn't going to be a resolution, and she believed him. But a movement. A door opened and walked through and walked back out of again, and then a horse pointed north on an evening that wasn't Tuesday, because that was what he had needed to do next. She put her hand on the old tree's bark, next to the place where his had been. "Stay for supper," she said. "Noah, too, if he wants to come down." He looked at her. "I made too much," she said. "I always make too much." He looked like he was going to say something and then decided against it and simply nodded and went to tell Noah. And she went back to the house to add more to the pot, and the evening settled over the orchard in the way May evenings do in Wyoming. Slowly, gently, with the particular quality of a day that has been full going gradually and without apology into re. The supper that evening in May set something in motion that none of them discussed, but all three of them felt. It was not a perfect meal. Evelyn had added to the pot in a hurry, and the proportions were off. Too much broth, not enough salt, the bread she pulled from the warming shelf drier than she would have liked. Noah ate 2 bowls without complaint, which was either politeness or genuine teenage hunger, and she suspected the latter. Silas ate steadily and said the stew was good, and she said it wasn't, and he said it was warm and filling, and sometimes that was enough. And she thought about that sentence for longer than she let on. They stayed until 8. Not late by most measures, but later than any of them had stayed in each other's company without a specific task providing the reason. And when they left, Silas washing his bowl without being asked, Noah pulling on his coat with the unhurried ease of someone who had been comfortable in a place for a long time, Evelyn stood in her kitchen doorway and watched the wagon go up the north trail and felt the kitchen settle around her into the particular silence that follows people who have been in a space and left it warmer than they found it. She washed the dishes. She left the lamp on for a while longer than usual. June arrived the way June does after a late spring, quickly, almost aggressively, as though making up for lost time. The valley turned the specific deep green of full summer, and the apple trees went from early fruit to the steady, patient business of growing it out. And the days got long enough that the light was still good at 8 in the evening, and Evelyn found herself resenting bedtime in the way she hadn't since she was a child, and summer seemed like something that could be spent rather than managed. The Tuesdays continued. They had not stopped, and she did not expect them to stop, but their character had changed in the way things change after honesty has been introduced. They were less careful, less precisely maintained, the conversation more direct and occasionally more difficult, and on the whole more satisfying than the careful dance of the previous months. Silas had started leaving his coat on the hook without asking. She had stopped explaining the pie as though it required justification. Small things. The small things were, she was finding, the entire thing. It was Noah who created the crisis, not intentionally. Nothing Noah did was without intention, but this particular intention had been so entirely pure that the fallout from it landed all the harder. He had been working for her every Saturday through May and into June, and on the 3rd Saturday of June he came at his usual time and worked his usual hours and ate his usual lunch, and then instead of going back to the orchard, he sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood and said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Evelyn set down her coffee cup. "All right. Are you going to stay?" he said. "Here, with us, in whatever this is becoming." He looked at her. "Because I need to know if I'm allowed to count on it." The question hit her somewhere she wasn't prepared for, not the content of it. She had known, on some level, that this was the question underneath all the Saturday lunches and the orchard work and the way he chose his father's chair every time. But the specific words, "Am I allowed to count on it?" The careful legal language of a boy who had already lost one person and was not going to mismanage the terms of allowing himself to need another. She was quiet for a moment. "What does counting on it mean to you?" she said. "Exactly." He thought about it. "It means that I don't have to keep waiting to see if this Tuesday is the last one," he said. "That I can just be here, without watching for when it stops." She understood. She understood it completely, and it moved through her chest like something with weight. "Noah," she said, "I am not going anywhere. This farm is mine, and I am not leaving it, and I am not leaving whatever is between your father and me, and I am not—" She stopped. She wanted to be precise. "I am not going to stop being someone you can count on. That is already decided on my end. It has been decided for a while." He looked at her for a long moment. The relief that moved across his face was the same relief she had seen at the kitchen window in November. Immediate, total, slightly devastating in its completeness. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He went back to the orchard. She stayed at the table for a while with her cold coffee and the knowledge that a 17-year-old boy had just asked her the question that his father had not yet fully asked, and that she had answered it, and that the answer had been true, and that saying a true thing out loud makes it more true rather than less. She told Silas that Tuesday. All of it. What Noah had asked, word for word, and what she had said. She owed him the information, and she owed him the full version, not the managed one. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, and she waited, because this was the kind of quiet that needed to run its course. "He asked you that," he said finally. "Yes." He looked at the table. "He didn't ask me." "No," she said. "He asked me." She watched him sit with that, the specific shape of what it meant that his son had needed to hear the answer from her rather than from him. The ways in which 3 years of careful management had communicated things to Noah that Silas had not intended to communicate. "I haven't been—" He stopped, started again. "I've been so careful not to say something I wasn't sure of that I think he decided I wasn't sure of anything." "I think so too," she said, not unkindly, plainly. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee. "I'll talk to him." "I know you will," she said. She did not ask what he would say. That was between the two of them, and she trusted Silas Boone, who said almost nothing that wasn't considered and almost nothing he didn't mean, to find the words that his son needed in the particular way that only his father could provide them. What she did not anticipate, could not have anticipated because it required a version of Silas she had been watching develop for months but had not yet seen fully arrived, was what happened the following Saturday. She was in the north section of the orchard in the morning, doing her count, when she heard both the wagon and a second horse coming up the lane. She looked up, and it was Silas on Copper and Noah in the wagon, which was unusual because they had not coordinated this, and they arrived in her orchard at 8 in the morning with no announced purpose, and Silas got off Copper and tied him to the fence and walked toward her through the apple trees with his hat in his hand. Noah stayed by the wagon. Silas stopped in front of her. The orchard was around them, the oldest tree at the north end with its heavy fruit clusters that he had said would hold and were holding, the morning light filtering through the leaves in the specific way of a June morning when the world is doing its best work. He said, "I talked to Noah." "I know," she said. "He told me. He came by Wednesday." Something shifted on Silas's face. "He came Wednesday." "He wanted me to know what you said." She kept her eyes on him. He seemed like a different person, lighter. He said you told him that this was real, and you weren't going to pretend otherwise, and that you should have said it sooner. Silas looked at the ground for a moment. "I should have." "Yes," she said, "but you said it." He looked up. His hat was still in his hands, and his jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was about to do something that required more courage than it looked like from the outside, and she had learned to recognize that look. Had been cataloging it since November, and she was recognizing it now. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I don't want to absorb your farm," he said. "I want you to know that I am saying what I'm about to say with the full understanding that your land is your land, and your operation is yours, and your name is your name, and none of that is part of what I'm asking." He looked at her directly. "What I'm asking is whether you want to build something, not out of what we already have, beside it." She was very still. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I know that. You know that. I'm probably saying it badly." "You're saying it fine," she said. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not to fix anything, not because the valley thinks it makes sense or because the land would work together or because Noah needs a—" He stopped. "Because I want to sit across from you at that table for the rest of my life. Because you are the most honest person I have ever known, and you make me want to be more honest than I am, and you make the world feel—" He searched for the word and landed on the plain one, the only one that fit. Real, again. In the north section of her orchard on a June morning, with the apple trees doing their patient work around them and Noah at the edge of the trees trying very hard to look like he wasn't watching, Evelyn Harper looked at Silas Boone, this difficult, careful, grief-carved, steadily honest man with his hat in his hands, and felt something that was not comfortable or simple or the romantic version of love that younger people describe, but was true, deeply and inconveniently and completely true, and had been true for longer than she had admitted, even to herself. "I have conditions," she said. He almost smiled. "I know. The farm stays mine, my name on the deed, my decisions, my operation." "Yes." "I'm not moving to the ranch. We work out the logistics of where and when, but I am not leaving this house." "I wouldn't ask you to, and you have to learn to make better coffee," she said, "because I'm not spending the rest of my life drinking yours." The almost smile became the real thing, the full version, the one she had been building a collection of since Christmas. And it changed his face completely, the way it always did, opened it up into something she had never gotten tired of seeing. "Noah makes the coffee," he said. "Then Noah needs to learn too." "I'll pass that along," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The orchard held them in its June morning quiet, the fruit heavy on the branches, the oldest tree standing solid at the north end with its roots deep in the ground and its limbs full. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath she hadn't known he was holding. Noah, at the edge of the trees, made no attempt whatsoever to pretend he hadn't heard. The wedding was in September, on a Saturday, when the apples were coming in, and the valley was the color of everything that summer had built toward, and the air had that particular quality of early fall in Wyoming that is not quite cold and not quite warm, and is somehow better than either. They did not have it in the church. Evelyn had not suggested it, and Silas had not pushed for it, and they were both, on this question, in agreement without needing to discuss it. They had it in the orchard, under the oldest tree, which was Evelyn's choice and which Silas accepted without objection, and Noah declared was, and he used this exact word, correct. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. Robert and Doris Henderson came because some things are inevitable, and the Callaways came because Martha Callaway would not have missed it, and Evelyn had made her peace with that. A few ranching families from the valley came, people Silas had known for years. A woman from Casper who had been Evelyn's closest friend since before Martin, who arrived on the Friday stage and stayed through Monday and told Evelyn privately that Silas Boone was the quietest man she had ever encountered and that she approved entirely. Noah stood beside his father. He wore his good coat, which he had grown into over the summer and which was going to need replacing before winter, and he stood straight and serious in the way he stood when he was feeling something large and was managing it with dignity, which Evelyn recognized as another thing he shared with his father. The ceremony was short. The man who performed it, a justice of the peace from the county seat, whom neither of them knew well but who had a plain and sensible manner that suited the occasion, said what needed to be said without embellishment, and Silas said what he needed to say in the specific, considered way. He said everything that mattered, and Evelyn said what she needed to say with the precision she brought to everything true. When it was done, the valley stood in her orchard under the apple trees in the September afternoon and ate pie and drank coffee and talked in the way that communities talk when they have watched something build from a distance and are now being allowed to stand inside it. And Evelyn moved through it with her new husband at her side. Not attached, not managed, not absorbed, but beside her, the way he had been for months, the way he had promised to be, the way she had built her conditions around, and he had met everyone. Martha Callaway found her by the old tree and said, with the warmth she always meant and the self-awareness she was developing slowly, "I said the wrong thing in January. I know that." Evelyn looked at her. "You said what you thought." "I thought the wrong thing," Martha said. "She's not someone to take care of him. She gestured slightly helplessly at the orchard, at the whole arrangement of the afternoon. "This." "Yes," Evelyn said, "this." What she meant by this was not a category she could have named precisely. It was the orchard and the kitchen and the two properties on either side of the north fence and the Tuesday mornings and the Thursday help and the Saturday work and the November laugh and the June morning and the old apple tree with its roots in the ground. It was Noah's question, "Am I allowed to count on it?" And her answer. It was Silas standing in the doorway of a locked room, and then opening it, and then walking through it, and out the other side, and pointing his horse north. It was not a rescue. It was not a merger. It was not one life folding into another. It was two people who had each built something real and difficult and entirely their own, deciding to build beside it rather than instead of it, and finding that beside was enough, and was in fact more than enough, and was, in the ways that mattered, everything. The reception did not last long. Neither of them was a long reception kind of person, and their guests understood this and departed by 4, and by 5 the orchard was empty of everyone except the 3 of them. And the September afternoon was going gold in the way it does in Wyoming when the season is tipping toward its end, and the light knows it and is making the most of what's left. Noah ate the last piece of pie standing up, which was technically rude, and which neither of his parents, the word settled into Evelyn's mind without fanfare, without announcement, simply as the thing that had become true, said anything about, because it was his day too, and he was 17 and the last piece of pie was his if he wanted it. They did the dishes together in the kitchen, all 3 of them, which was not a romantic conclusion to a wedding day, and was exactly right for that reason. Silas dried and Evelyn washed and Noah put away. And he put things in the wrong place twice because he still didn't fully know where everything went in her kitchen, and she corrected him both times. And the kitchen was warm, and the September evening was coming through the cracked window, and nothing about it was polished or arranged. Silas stayed. This had been understood but not discussed. His things were not yet moved. That was a logistics conversation for next week. But tonight he stayed, and Noah stayed in the spare room. And at some point late in the evening, when Noah had gone to bed and the kitchen was clean, and the lamps were burning low, Evelyn sat in her chair at the kitchen table, and Silas sat in his chair, which had been his chair since December, and the house was quiet around them. She thought about Martin. She let herself think about him plainly, without management, the way she had been learning to do for the past several months, with honesty and love and the understanding that love does not have a finite quantity that gets used up, that what she had given to Martin and what she was building with Silas were not in competition for the same resource. Martin had been her person for 15 years, and she had loved him badly sometimes, and well most of the time, and she carried him with her the way you carry the people who have shaped you, not as weight, but as architecture, part of how she was built. She thought Silas was doing the same thing with Margaret tonight, probably had been all day. She didn't ask, she didn't need to. It was enough to be here in the same room with someone who understood that grief and love were not opponents, that you could hold both at once, that the people you had lost did not require you to stop. "I'm going to need to expand the root cellar," she said, "before winter, for the apple storage." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I looked at it in August. The east wall needs reinforcing too." "I know about the east wall," she said. "I wasn't saying you didn't. You had the look." "I didn't have a look." "You always have a look about the east wall," she said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "It needs reinforcing," he said, with the stubbornness of a man who is right and knows it. "In the spring," she said. "Fall is better." "Spring," she said. "I have the harvest to get through first." He considered this. He drank his coffee, which was better than his because she had made it, and she had made it correctly. She had made it correctly every time for months, and he had been drinking it every Tuesday and occasionally Thursday, and increasingly Saturday, and had never once commented on the improvement, which she had found irritating and then funny, and had arrived at a kind of affection for in the way you arrive at affection for specific reliable frustrations in people you love. "Spring," he said finally. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen lamp threw its specific amber light across the table and across 2 coffee cups and the remains of the day, and the beginning of the thing they had just committed to with their whole lives, which was not simple and was not going to be simple, and was real in every way that mattered. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." He looked at her. "Your horse," she said. "In November, the first time." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "You could have kept riding." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost did," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm thanking you." He looked at the table. He looked at her. Outside the kitchen window, the September night had settled fully over the orchard, over the old apple tree with its harvest-heavy branches, over the north fence line that connected her land to his, over the valley that had been watching their story build from a distance and was now simply the place where they lived. 2 years and 4 months, he said. She looked at him. That's how long you baked it, he said. Before I stopped. She had not known he had counted. The knowledge of that sat in her chest with a weight that was not pain. 2 years, 4 months, and 3 days, she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the kitchen light. I should have stopped sooner, he said. You stopped when you were ready, she said. That's the only way it works. He nodded slowly. Outside, the apple trees held their fruit in the September dark, patient and full and rooted, the way things are when they have survived the seasons required to make them what they are. The oldest tree at the north end stood where it had always stood, caring more than expected and holding without apology, the way stubborn things do when they are given the conditions to keep growing. There's a thing that happens to people who have lived long enough to lose something they loved and found a way to keep going anyway. They develop a particular quality of attention, a way of being present that people who have not yet lost much do not have, cannot have, because it comes specifically from knowing what absence feels like and choosing, with that knowledge fully in hand, to be here anyway, to show up at the kitchen door, to open the window, to stop the horse. Silas Boone had that quality. Evelyn Harper had it. They had built it separately, in different houses on either side of a fence line, through different griefs at different paces, and they had arrived at the same table from different directions and found that the quality of attention they had each developed in the hardest years of their lives fit together the way things fit that have been shaped by real use rather than careful design. That was not romantic in the simple sense. It was not the love of young people who believe they have found the only person in the world for them, who have not yet been tested by time and loss and the specific disappointments that living brings. It was something harder and truer, the love of people who know exactly what they are choosing and choose it anyway, who have earned the right to say this is real by surviving enough to know the difference. Months later, on the first snowy Tuesday of December, the season turned full circle, the orchard stripped and resting, the north fence solid and maintained, the root cellar full. Evelyn came downstairs at 7 to find the kitchen already warm. Silas was at the stove. Not making coffee, he had accepted, finally, with the specific grace of a man who has lost an argument he should have lost sooner, that she made the coffee in the mornings. He was making eggs because that was his contribution, and he made them the same way every morning. Too much butter, not enough salt, perfectly cooked, which she had stopped complaining about after the 3rd week because they were, despite everything, good. Noah was at the table with his schoolwork because it was Tuesday and he had an hour before he needed to leave. And he was eating toast and reading something and not looking up in the focused way he had when he was actually reading rather than performing reading. 3 cups were already on the table. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at the scene, at the steam from the stove and the lamp on the table, and the snow coming down outside the window, and her kitchen full of people who had been strangers 3 years ago and were now the specific shape of her life. And she felt something that was not happiness exactly, because happiness was too thin a word for it. It was more like the recognition of rightness, the feeling of a thing that has been assembled correctly, with difficulty over time, from materials that were never meant to be simple. She came into the kitchen. She poured the coffee. She set a cup in front of Noah, who thanked her without looking up, which was rude, and which she had decided was a battle for another year. She set a cup at Silas's elbow at the stove, and he said nothing and picked it up immediately, which was, she had come to understand, his version of thank you. She sat down at her place at the table. Outside the kitchen window, the apple trees stood in their winter rows, stripped and gray and deeply rooted, carrying nothing visible and full of everything that would come in spring. The snow came down steady and unhurried, covering the orchard and the fence line and the north trail and the valley that held all of them, covering the ground the way December covers everything, not erasing it, just resting it, giving it the winter it needed to do what it was going to do next. Silas brought the eggs to the table and sat in his chair. Noah closed his book. The 3 cups steamed. The kitchen was warm and slightly too crowded in the specific way of spaces that are being lived in by more than one person, which is not a complaint but a condition, one that Evelyn had not had in 5 years and had not known she missed until it came back, imperfect and real and entirely hers. Silas looked at her across the table. She looked back. Outside, the first snow of winter kept coming down, covering everything that had been built and survived and chosen, and inside the kitchen the coffee was good and the eggs were too buttery, and nobody said a word about either, because some things don't need to be said to be completely, stubbornly, permanently true.